afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Warm welcome to this panel session. I am extremely pleased to be here with this panel to discuss about the lessons from Arctic Circle and other venues. When the Arctic Circle was established, knowledge of the natural environment in the region was limited. The Arctic Circle has changed that. Regular dialogues between the scientific experts, indigenous peoples with their local and traditional knowledge, and high-level officials of the Arctic states have helped to ensure successful developments. The Arctic Circle has also been involved in the scientific research for the Arctic region management. For example, first Arctic climate impact assessment was delivered to the Council in 2005, and likewise in 2011, the ministers approved the development of an Arctic resilience assessment. Besides that, it has also developing the Arctic Resilience Action Framework, which was approved by the Arctic Foreign Minister in 2007. In this session, we have 5 panelists. First of all, I would like to introduce the panelist of this session. His Excellency Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, who is the chairman of the Arctic Circle and president of the Iceland from 1996 to 2016, and he was heavily engaged in the governance of the Arctic region, and now he is the chairman of this Arctic Circle. And our next panelist is the Professor Rasmus Bertelsen, Nansen Professor of the UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, and the University of Akureyri, Iceland. He has been engaged in the research and publication, especially related with the Arctic science diplomacy and the governance of the Arctic region. Our next panelist is Dr. Sakaguchi, who is the president of the Ocean Policy Research Institute, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Japan. Prior to this position, he has been involved in the research and teaching with key positions in different organizations. And our next panelist is Dr. Pema Gyamtsho, who is the Director General in the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. Before leading this ICIMOD, he was the influential leader in Bhutan in the environmental sector. And our next panelist is Rupert Robinson, who is now the managing partner of the 7 Glaciers. After introducing the panelists, now I will request the panelists to express your initial remarks, and after that we will have question and answer session. I will request His Excellency for your initial remarks.
Well, thank you very much. And let me first. They were very small and tended to be specialized, and there was soon a growing sense as the Arctic Council developed that across the Arctic community there was a growing spirit that although people welcomed the Arctic Council and supported it, they were very much aware that those who assembled at the biannual ministerial meeting were people from the capitals, from Washington in America, from Ottawa in Canada, from Stockholm in Sweden, from Copenhagen with respect to the Kingdom of Denmark. So those people were far away from the Arctic communities. So there was this growing sense that the Arctic is much more than the Arctic Council, much more than traditional diplomatic gatherings where you sit around the table and you have name tags in front of you, Russia, United States, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and so on. So the challenge was, how do you make the Arctic dialogue open and democratic? How do you make sure that anyone interested in the Arctic and the future of the Arctic can turn up and speak without being an ambassador from a country? And this was especially important because you can say many things about the Arctic communities and the indigenous people, but they tend to be very democratic in spirit, very inclusive in spirit. Everybody in the village is basically invited, whether it's in Alaska or Greenland or Canada or whatever. So therefore, together with some other friends, we started in 2011, 2012 to discuss how can we do this. And gradually we came up with the idea we will establish what we called the Arctic Circle. And as you can see from the logo, it's a play on words. It's on one hand a geographical area, but as you see from the logo, it's also a circle of people. A circle of people around the table. And having attended the World Economic Forum, the Clinton Global Initiative, and many other international gatherings, I wanted to avoid the straitjacket that formal representatives and leaders of organizations have a priority. I wanted to make it a platform where people and organizations and communities could come on their own terms, with their full authority, and in control of the session and the agenda. So the Arctic Circle was an innovation not just for the Arctic, but for the entire global cooperation, because the principle is we invite, as you see here, if you take the last session on preventing the melting of the ice, organizations to present proposals for sessions in an open democratic bid. And if they are approved, they have full authority over the session. They decide the content, they decide the speakers, and the session is in their name. You cannot do that these days in the World Economic Forum, for example. You cannot do that at the United Nations. And I can give you a long list of places where you cannot do that. But we didn't really know whether the global community would welcome this opportunity. Then we also had the cases, as was mentioned before, the observer states in the Arctic Council: France, Germany, United Kingdom, China, India, Singapore, Korea, Japan. And as my good friend, the late Michel Rocard, former Prime Minister of France, who was appointed first by Sarkozy as France's representative to the polar region, including the Arctic Council, having turned up at many Arctic Council meetings and never be allowed to speak, said very memorably, France is not accustomed not to be allowed to speak. So it was not just the need to create a platform for the communities, the ordinary people, the democratic citizens of the Arctic. There was also a need to create a platform for all these countries, states, companies, universities, think tanks, and others who wanted and had something to contribute to the dialogue. So at the first Arctic Circle Assembly, we got about 1,000 people. And everybody said, wow, because we announced it at the National Press Club in Washington in May and said we're going to organize an assembly in October. Everybody thought we were crazy. And then the next year, 1,500 people turned up. And every time since, over 2,000 people from more than 70 countries in almost 200 sessions with 600 speakers come together every October in Iceland. And then gradually we got requests from other countries, can't we have mini assemblies, which we decided to call forums, in other countries. So we started to do that in Washington, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Singapore, in Korea, in China, now here in Abu Dhabi, in March in Tokyo, next year early in Berlin. So now the Arctic Circle has become a truly global moving train, as we witness here. And these forums are all different in nature, whereas the assembly tends to be the same. And then we added mission councils, virtual broadcast on the internet, and all these kind of operations, and social media communication. And what all of this proves is that there is a democratic desire all over the world to engage in the Arctic future. And I say democratic desire, because fundamentally, my friends, we're all citizens of this planet. Although some of us live in the third pole area, some of us live in the Arctic, we are basically all citizens of the planet. And what happens to the planet will affect us all, wherever we live. I was told at lunchtime by my Japanese friend that what's happening to the glaciers in Himalaya is transforming the weather system in Japan. And everybody knows the melting of the Arctic sea ice is destroying the monsoon weather patterns in Asia. And one of the reasons when you ask Singapore, why do you want to be an observer state in the Arctic Council, they say, if the Greenland ice sheet continues to melt, Singapore will be history because of the rising sea level. The greatest security threat to Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Singapore, Shanghai, is the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. So I think we can now celebrate that although it's less than 10 years since the Arctic Circle was established, it will be the 10th anniversary in October, we have demonstrated the engagement of the global community, students, activists, specialists, scientists, officials, business leaders, and others, in this diverse dialogue and cooperation that is moving us forward. So one of the most fundamental lessons, I think, for the third pole Himalayan countries when they look at the Arctic evolution in the last 10 years, yes, it's great to have institutions. It's great to have intergovernmental high-level task force. It's of course necessary to have a ministerial summit. But we should realize there's a wider community out there of people who have lived in the Himalayas long before India became independent, long before the colonial powers left that part of the world. They have been there for thousands of years, and they also need a role. But also people in other countries who are genuinely, respectfully interested in the future of the Himalayas need somehow to find a way to have their voices heard. And in that sense, the Arctic Circle is a new type of a democratic, open way of communicating and linking people together and talking, as we have seen here today, without the controlling freaks in the governmental ministries. And I say that as somebody who served in public office for a long time. That's important. That's important. So hopefully you will find ways in the third pole region to engage democratically in an open way, not just with the people who live there, but also with the wider citizenship of the world, who respectfully and genuinely are interested in the future of your part of the world.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now I request Professor Rasmus for your initial remarks, especially focusing on the Arctic science diplomacy and including recent developments.
Yes, I can hear this microphone is on. First of all, congratulations to the organizers with this event, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to be here. I want to talk briefly about the value of the Arctic Circle, and it actually follows up on something that Ambassador Einar Gunnarsson was talking about, the value of the Arctic Council. So I'm a professor of international relations, a political scientist, and there we have terms as, for example, epistemic communities, so communities of knowledge. And I think the great value of the Arctic Circle has been to contribute to a common learning and understanding and shaping of the Arctic as it adapts to a changing global order. talking about the Arctic in the broader world, Catherine, I hope I remember the name correctly, Friedman from this Ted Stevens Center asked the question, well, how was it possible with this Arctic Cooperation, Arctic Council, how was it possible, what made it possible? My answer there would be that I'm very, very skeptical of the term Arctic exceptionalism. I would basically, as a political scientist, say that the Arctic has historically, today and in the future, it reflects international order. So we just see the Cold War, we had a US-Soviet bipolarity, a bipolar system, the Cold War, and the Arctic was strictly divided between the Soviet Arctic and the Nordic and North American Arctic. Then we have US victory in the Cold War, we have the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We have after that a unipolar system where the United States is the only superpower and the United States can set the rules of international affairs. And of course Russia is in very deep crisis and China is still a giant, much poorer developing country. I would say that was the basis of circumpolar, what I would call liberal Arctic cooperation, liberal because it was sustainable development, environment, science, etc., instead of military competition. And therefore we had these circumpolar liberal organizations as the Arctic Council, the International Arctic Science Committee, University of the Arctic, Barents Corporation, Bering Corporation. But of course that was not the end of history. International order continues changing. We have the return of China as one of the world's largest economies, and I say return rather than rise because if you look back hundreds, thousands of years, the long-term normal is that China is one of the world's largest economies. So we increasingly have a bipolar international system where the United States and China are the world's by far largest national economies, which very much shapes the Arctic. And we have Russia returning as a traditional Eurasian great power, which leads into the war in Ukraine, and the exact reasons for that war is a long and difficult discussion. But these developments, I mean, the basis for the post-Cold War Arctic no longer exist. And just to conclude on the Arctic Circle, I think the Arctic Circle has played a very, very positive role as a forum for learning, for interpreting, for shaping that changing Arctic in a changing international system. And of course, what was very clear in the Arctic was you saw how the outsiders, Asia, etc., were coming into the Arctic. Many people thought that was particularly Arctic. No, it reflected a world where the economic center of the world is returning to Asia, and a world which is much less Western, that we in the West have become accustomed to the last couple of centuries. That's very difficult for us. I think we've had some extremely difficult situations in recent years. We first have the the corona pandemic, which leads to a breakdown in international exchange, communication, etc. And then we have this absolutely horrible war in Ukraine. And that, of course, leads to so much stifling of international exchange and which we also see, of course, at Arctic Circle. And I'm very concerned about that. So I think I could go on about this very long time. I should conclude now. But I think lessons for the third pole is to be very conscious about how the third pole, historically, today, and in the future, is embedded in global order. There are very large powers in the region, India, China, etc. You have outside large powers, which also plays a big role. Russia, historically, the British Empire, today, the United States. And I think the third pole countries should be very conscious of how global change and perhaps outside conflict can affect their cooperation in the third pole. Thank you very much.
I just want, yeah, exactly, now we have it. I just want to point out to the monitor that we have more time than was showing before.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Professor. Now I would like to request Dr. Sakaguchi for your initial remarks, especially focusing on the importance of contribution of the Asian countries to the Arctic issues also.
Thank you very much, Ganesh. My name is Sakaguchi again from Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Sasakawa Peace Foundation is part of Nippon Foundation, which is the largest private foundation in Asian countries. And we deal with lots of wide variety of issues. But one thing, the policy we have is to make the world as peace as possible, regardless the politics. We are completely, private foundations. And Sasakawa Peace Foundation has a longest history to deal with Arctic issues, not only in Japan, but also maybe in Asia. For more than 30 years, we have the experience. And also, regardless the politics, so we have a good relationship with Russia and also China, whatever countries we dealing with as a friendship countries, and especially the Arctic issues, as President Grímsson mentioned. For example, 30 years ago, no one in Japan was aware of the importance of Arctic. But our chairman, Mr. Sasakawa, predicted it's going to be more and more important. As Med mentioned, we have a sort of problem in between Russia and Japan because at the end of the war, the northern part of the island was taken away, and the problem has not been solved yet. But, overcoming these difficulties, we need to have peaceful Arctic area, and also environmental issues, and also Northern Sea Route issues, and Coastal Guard issues. All those issues will become important. That was predicted by our chairman, Mr. Sasakawa, 30 years ago. And then since then, we did a step-by-step research, and also joining Arctic Circle is one of our successful stories, because the principle of Arctic Circle is democratic, and also it's a venue to have the dialogue. Right? So that regardless with the larger countries or smaller countries, or larger voices or smaller voices, whatever, we are on the one platform, and exchange the dialogue and listen together. And the typical example is the session in this morning, the third pole issues. In Japan, as President Grímsson briefly mentioned, scientists are aware of the connection of the monsoon change from Himalayan weather change. It affects a lot. In last 10 years, in Japan, we have almost no 4 seasons, but just 2 seasons, summer and winter. And both summer and winter, we have lots of snow, storm. And that storm happened, for example, more than 20 years ago. It happened just once in 100 years, the possibility. But these days, in last 5 years, almost every year, unbelievably, destroying storm happened in winter and summer. And scientists have already analyzed it is due to the effect of the monsoon change from the Himalayan area. So importance of the third pole, not only science, but also the disaster prevention, mitigation. These issues are very, very important, not only the 8 countries, but also in Japan and also China and some other Asian countries. But the problem is people are not aware of that. So with the platform of Arctic Circle, we can let the people be aware of the importance and mutually support each other. These are the basic spirit of Arctic Circle, which well fit with our Sasakawa Peace Foundation's activities. So that's why I'm here and very happy to be here. And one more thing I would like to tell you is upcoming March this year, we are going to organize Arctic Circle Japan Forum after this Arctic Circle Abu Dhabi Forum. And it will be the first big international conference after COVID situation in Japan. And we are expecting lots of participants will appear in Tokyo. But one very important session is a trilateral meeting among Japan, China, and Korea. As some of you are aware of, those 3 countries have a little bit strange, tense in these maybe in the last 10 years. And up to 5 years ago, they had a Arctic ambassadors meeting. It's a governmental meeting almost every 2 years, hosted by Japan, Korea, China, Circle. But after the strange tension spread among those 3 countries, it stopped, and they haven't had any conversation at all. But through the spirit of Arctic Circle as a democratic platform, regardless that government to government or politics and politics, we are going to have a trilateral Arctic ambassadors meeting. This is just one example. So we are expecting at the Arctic Circle Japan Forum to have more and more fruitful democratic meeting. And I think the session is closed, but it will be flexible, and the registration is still open up to the 20th of February next month. So please consider to participate and have a fruitful discussion as we had this morning. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sakaguchi. Now I would like to request Dr. Pema for your initial remark.
Thank you very much, Chair, and very inspiring to hear all the panelists, other panelists, and so on. So in the third pole, Hindu-Kush-Himalayan region, we are also moving very rapidly towards strengthening regional cooperation. I think I heard one of the earlier panelists talking about the need to build trust and confidence. I think that is very, very important, and that is a lesson that we need to take forward. So the trust and confidence in our region is also increasing. For example, I am the first Director General of this organization after nearly 40 years. So that's quite fast enough, I think. But as again, I think Mr. Mate the earlier said, Bhutan is a little bit like Iceland in the Arctic Circle. We are perhaps trying to push above our weight or punch above our weight. But I think we need to face these challenges and try to take it on. But having said that, the ground conditions for stronger regional cooperation is already there. For example, ICIMOD's governance, the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development's governing board, consists of high-level officials, secretaries from the line ministries, the ministries of forest, environment, and climate change over 8 member countries. So in a way, we already have our senior officials grouping. And then we are already working over the years, working in all our member countries on the ground with different partners, with the CSOs, with communities, with indigenous groups, with local governments, with federal government. So as it is, we are working on a number of fields already on the ground. So the ingredients are there. Now it is basically to take it forward and have this umbrella mechanism to coordinate cooperation, to strengthen cooperation. So we call it the power of 8. So we are also, 8 member countries. We also have very big countries, very small countries. And I think the lessons that we learn from the Arctic Circle and the Alpine Convention, and also newly formed conventions like the Carpathian Convention, are very, very useful to us. So we have developed this draft institutional recommendation for an institutional mechanism, trying to take out elements from all these organizations. From the Arctic Circle, as President Grímsson repeatedly mentioned, it allows for a very liberal way of functioning. And we are trying to take that, and we have copied elements of that. We have looked at the Alpine Convention, where the countries are more homogeneous. And there are good elements from there, which we also took up in there. And we looked at the challenges that the Carpathian Convention, that grouping, is facing as a new organization. So based on all this, we are also trying to take forward this need for regional cooperation. Now, if there are challenges in the Arctic Circle, of course, the challenges are also manifold in our region. We have currently the situation with Afghanistan and Myanmar. But again, as I heard earlier, isolation or isolating is not the solution. I think inclusion will always be the solution. So that is one lesson, and we try to include them as much as possible, online discussions, and if possible, to have them also attend meetings in person. The other lesson is that we also urge our member countries, the officials from our member countries, to try to reach out, to hold hands, to join hands, rather than finger pointing. Even between the region and outside the region, within the developed world and the developing world, instead of saying, okay, because of what you did 200 years ago or what you're doing, we are suffering. I think it's better to change that narrative into saying, okay, there is a lot more pollution in our region, a lot more impact of climate change in our region, because as of now even, a lot of the polluting industries from the West are outsourced in our region. Maybe we are wearing the shoes that we buy in Europe, produced in Bangladesh. We are probably driving cars that were produced in the region. So a lot of polluting industries were outsourced to this region, and perhaps it is time also for the West to invest with resources and technologies to make them less polluting. So I think we need to change that narrative a bit. But I see a good future for our region. The intention is there, commitment is there, and with the inspiration that we derive from the Arctic Circle and other conventions, I remain very, very hopeful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Pema. Now I'd like to request Robert Robinson for his remark.
Oh, it is working. So, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to the Arctic Circle. I think if it wasn't for the Arctic Circle, 7 Glaciers would have not been here or had stretched its wings into the Arctic region. So just to provide you a bit of background about who we are, for those, I don't think there was a bio on us or who we are, and to give you some context behind my remarks. So I'm Rubert, I'm the CEO of Aspiration and 7 Glaciers for Europe, Middle East, Africa and Asia. We're an investment, a carbon market, carbon asset investor. We invest into nature-based projects, infrastructure mitigation projects around the world. We have a portfolio of around about 3.9 billion. We have 74% of our assets are in nature-based solutions. We have 13% of our assets in water filters and cook stoves, predominantly in Africa and India. And we have 11% of our projects into energy mitigation projects. Predominantly those are also in India, some in Africa, so those are hydro, solar, hydro dams, waste-to-water energy plants as well. So our regions, we cover Africa, Asia, we have South America, North America, US, Alaska, Canada, India, Pakistan, and we also have one of our first projects in the United Arab Emirates, which is in Qatar, which is reaching net zero for an energy park or a digitalization park, is bringing energy savings to them. We're also stretching our wings, and hence the birth of 7 Glaciers, and stretching our wings through the funding. And we set up our office in Iceland, in Reykjavik, 1 year ago. We're setting up our office in United Kingdom, and moving slowly into Europe. We were born out of America, but slowly moving into Europe, to look for investment projects where we can contribute to the climate change. And the importance of these conferences is unsurmountable, because traditionally we would have gone to the Infrastructure Investment Summit or Davos, or bonds and finance and tax initiatives, highly interesting to a financier, but maybe so not. And as the world has changed, the climate is affecting us, along with the cost of living crisis, the geopolitics has moved on. It's more important that finance people like myself engage more openly, more readily, and understand the issues that you're facing, or what is facing the world, on an environmental point, a social point, and an economic point. They all come together. You can't just pick one and the others don't exist. What it brings for us is contextualizing it. The Arctic Circle, through the sessions, contextualize that information. We meet people like the audience here today who talk about the third pole, who talk about Greenland, who talk about the energy transition that we need to adopt in Greenland to help them to reach that net zero. We need to look at infrastructure in the right context as well. They all come hand in hand. Arctic Circle to us has enlightened us, will bring more finance to this market, where we can continue to invest into nature-based projects and find those right projects. We only work with local developers. All our projects are verified in a nature-based context, and we will continue to do so. So it is, great to be here, great to listen to these things, and good to be at the Arctic Circle, not only in Iceland, but obviously it's stretched now into UAE, and now it's stretched into Japan. That is important for us, and as much as we can bring the finance, bring the scientists, bring the technical, the engineers together in this type of conference, and the local communities, the regions, and bring that dialogue, we will get a better understanding on how we can help. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just, Chairman, point out, I think we will add additional 10 minutes to this, so we have altogether 15 minutes until we finish.
Yeah. Thank you, Your Excellency. Thanks to all panelists for your initial remark. Now I want to turn to the audience, respecting the audience. I want, let's have some questions from the audience.
Hi, okay. Great panel. And I appreciate Professor Bertelsen's comment about the Arctic being a reflection of the liberal international system, the norms and principles that were set up in the post-Cold War II or excuse me, post-World War II order. In the interest of full disclosure, I also am trained as a political scientist and in international law, so I love this stuff, okay? So my question for you is, given that, whether you frame it as the international liberal order is under stress, or maybe it's crumbling, or some people go as far as saying it's done, it's over, right? Whichever variation on that theme you choose, I think it's clear that the system is changing and that it's in flux. And I just wonder if, as opposed to the Arctic being a reflection of the international order, if there's an opportunity in this window of time for the Arctic to serve as a model of governance and lead, right? And as a laboratory for testing different ideas, so that on the other end, when we come out of this, whatever that looks like, there will be some real new insights and ideas, and maybe even, again, new governance models that could serve as an example to the world, as opposed to being a reflection of the world.
My question is to Sakaguchi. You mentioned that what is happening in the third pole region is impacting Japan and far eastern region of China, as well as Korea. We understand some of the rivers which are originating, like Yellow River, and that it goes as far as that side. That is understood. But from our point of view, can you elaborate a little bit what will be the potential collaboration between Korea and, of course, Japan? China is part of the ICIMOD member countries. So from your point of view, what are the potential cooperation with ICIMOD and these countries? Because you are one of the recipients of the impact, so why not we look into this, and that will be a good way forward for further regional cooperation in this region.
Thank you, Catherine. How to say, I mean, we're facing these tectonic shifts in like distribution of economic and scientific and technological, etc., power, which is shaping the world around us. But there's, of course, also, as I said, that there's an interpretation and a shaping of what's going on. And your question, it makes me think of Mike Pompeo's May 2019 speech in Rovaniemi, where, of course, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made it very clear that the United States saw this global competition with China in the Arctic. I'm a Danish national, and of course the United States has made it very clear to the Danish government what it thinks about Chinese investments and involvement in Greenland. And there one could think about, okay, so how could you shape, how could you develop Chinese investment in Arctic infrastructure? How can you shape, develop Chinese participation in scientific activities in the Arctic? I mean, there it was very clear that the Secretary of State at that point set out what the United States thinks about this Sino-American competition in the Arctic. And of course, as Einar Gunnarsson pointed out, that after the 2014 Ukraine-Crimea crisis, I mean, there was one response. And I mean, I think that's what in political science could be called horizontal escalation. I mean, you can escalate vertically on the battlefield, you become more and more violent, or you can bring a conflict into another area, where, of course, the Arctic 7 and European Union, etc., made the choice to respond to the Russian annexation of Crimea with various political, military, financial sanctions in the Arctic. I mean, that's a political choice. And And now we are in this absolutely horrible situation where a breakdown in Eastern European security order has escalated across regions and issue areas, including the Arctic. But there, of course, there is strategy, foreign security policy. I mean, there's always conscious choices about what policy do you choose. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Ide.
Thank you very much for the very good question. But to be honest, it's a difficult answer because, for example, we once tried to work together in between bilaterally, Korea and Japan, for the Arctic issues. For example, very simple example to ship time sharing for the Arctic research vessels we proposed, because Japan is going to build a new icebreaker ship for the Arctic research, and Korea has already there. And let's try to, the ship time share to minimize the cost. But, politically speaking, it stopped. And that's why we are going to reorganize trilateral meeting instead of bilateral meeting, including China. So these are the first step. And also, to be honest, I haven't heard, I haven't known anything about the activity of ICIMOD. But this morning I learned a lot. And the existence of this organization, including 8 countries, but bilaterally, there are lots of conflict, right? Like India and China is fighting all days, right? Among the Himalayan areas, but they are trying to find a solution. So just like this, let them be aware. Also, many Japanese are not aware of the importance of the teleconnection in between Himalayan monsoon and East China Sea and the South China Sea, the weather, right? So initially, try to be on the same platform like Arctic Circle, and then let us together to think about how serious the situation is becoming, and then make a next step to work together. So that is a good way. So I learned this morning from him and from Pema, and also from all of you. So why don't we follow the scheme and try to be a good friend in between Japan and China and Korea, and then work together with ICIMOD. So that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you. Still more questions, because we have 5 minutes, 40 seconds left.
This panel was excellent because there are so many intersections and that are really important. I'd like possibly to just put out there the value of all the different Arctic strategies that are being developed, and how they are or aren't interrelated or interconnected. You've got the ones that are very political, high level, talk about the need and value for doing research in the Arctic, potentially investments, but not stating specifically which ones. And then we've got the situation where historically China was prepared to invest in the Arctic because they play the long game, and how challenging it is to get investment in the Arctic, displacing China, because it may take 10 plus years to get a mine, go from finding the mineral to actually sort of full exploitation, and investors just not waiting, I'm so tired, but just not prepared to wait that long for their return on investments. But then you've got Arctic research vessels being built, you've got coast guards, you've got naval bases, but I can tell you is in our region, there's virtually no ports and no fuel facilities to actually provide fuel for the vessels that are being built for the research purposes. So it's so piecemeal. The problem is that I see as the lack of full integrated plans or strategies that recognizes the need and value for investments, but so that everything that is needed to support each other is built at the same time in a strategic way, recognizing there's real value in the collaborative cooperation of these investments in all these different sectors, whether it is in research, in business, and in security defense.
I wanted to ask the question of Rupert about the projects you're investing in. And is there anything that could be done to help us make a meaningful change in the black carbon issue? It's not CO2 reduction, but it is probably I think the scientists call it a short-term forcer of climate change that's very, very significant.
Well, I just want to make a few comments on this state of affairs, which often is related to the war and the Arctic. I think it's very important what Rasmus emphasized, that Pompeo came to Finland to the Arctic Council ministerial meeting in 2019, if I remember correctly. And first of all, vetoed the possibility of having for the first a joint declaration from the ministerial meeting. That was the first Arctic Council ministerial meeting which didn't have a joint declaration, if I remember correctly. And nobody was talking about war in Ukraine because of that. He was talking about China, primarily. And then he made this famous speech where he warned the other Arctic states against cooperating with China. And because by coincidence, the Arctic Circle was holding a forum in Shanghai a week later, most of these ambassadors from the Arctic states came to Shanghai to speak. It was kind of paradoxical situation. So let us not overemphasize that the war in Ukraine has caused a pause, as if that is the only explanation. It is more complicated. My second point is this, and I ask my good friend Ambassador Gunnarsson to correct me if I'm wrong. As was pointed out earlier here today, the agreement on the Arctic Ocean, on fisheries in the Arctic Ocean, when it's free of ice, which is a remarkable international agreement made a few years ago, including not only key Arctic states, but the European Union, Japan, China, Russia, of course, United States. And it was an historic agreement, first time in history that nations came together to prevent fisheries in an ocean unless it was based on a scientific research. To the best of my knowledge, a few months ago in Korea, the parties to this agreement held a meeting, and I see you not go ahead. This is worth emphasizing, because at the same time there is a pause in the Arctic Council instigated by the governments. They go to Korea and meet around the table together with Russia on probably the most important Arctic treaty. Because I think that Arctic Ocean Agreement is the most important Arctic treaty in existence. And of course the media hasn't paid much attention to this meeting, but it took place and it was very productive. And there, United States, European Union sat together with Russia discussing the future of probably the most important part of the Arctic Ocean. So then my third point is this: we have international law on ocean transport. And that means that big part of the Arctic oceans are open to shipping beyond the territorial limits. And apart from the Arctic Ocean, beyond the 200 miles of the Arctic state is also open for fisheries from other countries. that means that China and Russia can continue to be economically engaged in ocean transport, ocean fishing within the Arctic. Big time, big time. So it's not correct. It's not correct to say that we have somehow instigated now a pause in cooperation with Russia because of the war, or the tension with China recently has escalated because it happened before when Pompeo made this speech. So my point is really this: we have to be honest about this state of affairs. We have to take everything into account, and we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we cannot continue with the Arctic Council, but we can continue with the partners to the Arctic Ocean Treaty Agreement? And what are we going to do if the ice continues to melt and the northern sea routes continue to be open for traffic? And my final point is this: everybody agrees the advancement of science is an international global affair. And as the expedition leader, Marcus Rex, of the historic Mosaic expedition, which was the first time in history that the world scientific community was able to conduct research in the high Arctic North Pole north during wintertime. We didn't have any data on what happens in the high Arctic, Central Arctic during wintertime. And as the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany has said, that historic scientific expedition would not have been possible without China and Russia. So I don't think we in the other Arctic states have answered the question, how are we going to continue Arctic science in the years and the decades to come without the involvement of Russia and China?
Yeah.
And what will that Arctic science look like? I think these are all legitimate questions. I'm not answering them. I'm simply saying they are questions that we have to deal with in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Your Excellency. Now, Professor Rasmus, you want to respond?
Yes, Madeleine Redfern, you asked an excellent question about strategies. Made me think about the famous business professor Peter Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I have myself worked in organizations that produced endless amounts, universities that produced endless amounts of strategies of absolutely no consequence because the culture stayed the same. So I think the question is, what kind of culture of Arctic work, Arctic cooperation do we want to create? And I'm basically thinking, I think the Arctic Circle has been a very, very important exercise in trying to create a culture. And there I think one choice is whether we want to create a culture of collaboration, work, etc. And it's not a question of naivety or things like that, but deals with the world as it is changing. And quite frankly, I mean, we can just look around here in this conference center. The future doesn't look like me. I mean, the future does not look like a middle-aged white male Protestant. And there's a lot of middle-aged white male Protestants that have a lot of problems dealing with that. So are we creating a culture of dealing with the world as it is changing, or what I'm very concerned about, creating a West against the rest culture where we are sitting in a Western bubble and we don't want to talk to people we have conflicts with? So I think that's a very fundamental choice we stand before. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Rupert, yeah, you.
First of all, I'd just like to address Madeleine Redfern's question about investment in infrastructure. I'm not going to actually answer your question, but there was a gentleman in this audience who is amazingly well connected in that region, and he's the person who asked me the question about climate funding. So Meade Treadwell, Lieutenant Governor or ex-Lieutenant Governor of Alaska, is very well connected with an infrastructure connectivity in the Arctic region, and he's more prepared to answer that question, or better prepared to answer that question than for me. I invest into the climate. To answer Meade's question, and I think this was the question, is that financing to climate is a relatively new thing. Investing into climate projects is new. Obviously, investing into infrastructure is not new. And the way that we have done our climate investing is that we create the projects, we partner with lots of different organizations around the world, we find finance from lots of different sources, and it is not until that project completes is that we either pass that project on to the end sponsor, we recycle the money, and then we go back into investing more. So over 14 years, we've been investing into these climate projects and eventually built them up. And it's generally a slow process. What the world is recognizing now, and most probably relatively recently in the financing, is you first got the green bonds and they started coming in, but they weren't ready yet. There were some problems with that. You have now got big funds around the world, from JP Morgan to Goldman Sachs. You had announcements made yesterday at this conference where from Mazda to ADNOC to Mubadala, who are investing billions into climate projects. But that has recently only just come. And we're now creating new funds, which gives us a greater ability, more capital availability to put into projects rather than wait for them. And we now need the supply of projects to come through, whether it's a nature-based project or to an infrastructure project. Infrastructure is an interesting one, is that it's a massive time lag, and that comes back to you. It's a 10 to 15 plus years to actually establish a project, get the financing, sort the financing out. That does need to speed up. And I think that people have just been ignoring the infrastructure market for so long, Madeleine, for a long, long time. It's catching up. It's going to take a lot of time. Final point is in connection, and I think this is to do with China or Russia, is that in finance terms, we are not against Russia or China investing into projects. It's about the percentage of that investment into that project, is that we would way prefer to have lots of people investing into the project, but not one majority holder that can twist that project. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. As the time is running out, now I'm going to wrap up this session. Thanks to our panelists for providing the very comprehensive. You want to add something?
Just, I think, reflecting on all that we have learned and shared, I think I just want to again reiterate that the Hindu Kush Himalayan region is a unique region, and that it matters, as we have found it matters on the climate and weather patterns in Japan. It matters in terms of migration. Adaptation is the oldest form of migration. What happens to the millions of people in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region if the situation there deteriorates further? They will have to move out, and they'll have to go somewhere. So I think what happens there really matters. The second point is time is running out, as I've mentioned. Disasters are already there, impact is already there. Now, how fast and how swiftly we can move to address that would be something that I would like to also flag here. And of course, there would be a tsunami of people from the Hindu Kush Himalayan region going elsewhere. We have so much diversity, about, I think Ambassador mentioned earlier, the diversity of ethnic groups here. We have over 1,000 spoken language in the region recorded. But in diversity, there is strength. And just coming to Professor Sakaguchi's point, between India and China, there's friendly posturing going on, I would say. Not a single shot was fired in the past or so on. So, of course, the tension is there, but that doesn't rule out actions on the ground. That doesn't rule out cooperation. And really welcome Japan and Korea to come to the table, just like the Arctic Circle countries have come forward to support the HKH region. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, panelists, for providing very comprehensive view on the lessons from Arctic Circle and other venues in such a very short time frame. The key message, I think, from this session is that Arctic Circle and other venues has been crucial for the knowledge generation, collaboration, and policy dialogues for the better Arctic region management. And still, we have to do many work in this changing global order and the impacts of climate change to deal with the complex governance and management problems of the Arctic region. As the problems do not know the administrative boundary, isolation does not work. And we need collaborative efforts across borders, and we need enhanced cooperation for better management of Arctic region. The equally important is the cross-learning between the different venues, such as the Arctic Circle and the third pole process. How the lessons from the Arctic Circle can be translated to solve the problems of the third pole region, Indigenous Himalayan region, and the vice versa. And I would like to thank you, panelists and audience, for your kind attention and interaction to make this session successful. And I would like to thank you all very much, and I would like to wrap up this session here. Thank you.